Hello there, welcome back to Jennie Designs with Paper and this week's episode of Crime and Coloring, where I take you on an alphabetical journey through the early crime of the United States. Before we talk about the crime, let's talk about the coloring. I have chosen the My Favorite Things Recipe for Happiness stamp set today. I love these little chefs. I think they are super cute. And I am going to be coloring with Prismacolor pencils today. I have a scrap piece of Georgia Pacific cardstock because I feel like when I'm coloring with colored pencils, I want all the texture that I can get from that colored pencil media. If I'm looking for a smooth blend and a smooth coloring, I'm going to go with Copic markers. I think that colored pencils have a really fabulous texture all on their own. So I am using my colored pencils. I do bring in a blending pen or blending pencil rather a couple of times to kind of help the transition between colors to make it look better. There we go. The first thing I'm going to do is ink up these stamps with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink. I am going to leave the stamps in my Misty Stamp Positioner because the wax from the colored pencils is going to dull down that black outline. So I will restamp this when I am finished coloring everything. I will be using a light and medium, wow, words are hard, light, medium, and dark pencil for all of my images, and I will be using a yellow group, a green group, a blue group, and an aqua group, as well as some skin tones and some grays for the metallics and the shadows. I start with colored pencils in the shadow with the darkest, and I work forward toward the highlight with the lightest color, and all of the places that I color will be colored over at least 2 times in that order. Okay. So now that we've talked about the coloring, let's hop into our crime segment. So you may have noticed that I forgot how to alphabetize and completely skipped the state of Colorado. Yes, I did. I went from California to Connecticut and just jumped right over Colorado. It's a pretty state, but my experience in Colorado this summer was less than helpful, and I think I may have blocked that out entirely. But to make that up to you and all of the residents of Colorado, I have picked a really good story for you this week. Colorado was granted statehood August 1st, 1876, and our story takes place just a few years after that. So buckle up, Buttercup. It's going to be a ride, a train ride, a robbery, subterfuge, and murder. The November 3rd, 1887 robbery of a Denver and Rio Grande train near Grand Junction, Colorado is the stuff of legend. The legend being that it was the first big criminal act by Butch Cassidy, but not really. Here's what really happened. This was the first attempted robbery of a DGNR train. The train was about 5 miles east of Grand Junction, Colorado, when it ran into a pile of rocks blocking the tracks. The locomotive engine stopped, and 3 masked men entered the express car in a robbery attempt. Now, the actual gang of robbers did consist of 4 men, but not the men originally attributed to the first robbery of the train. 2 of the robbers, Bob, aka Ira, and Jack Smith, first showed up in Colorado criminal history 2 years earlier in 1885 as key witnesses in the murder of rancher Sam Jones of Unaweep Canyon, Colorado. So let's back up just a little bit to May 19, 1855. Sam Jones saddled his horse and left his ranch headed for Silverton, Colorado. Sam told his ranching partner, John L. Campbell, that he was going to Silverton to conduct business on mining claims. He anticipated receiving several $1,000s from a lawsuit. Now, not a lot is known about these 2 men. Okay, I cannot find a birth record, not even a death record, and it's a murder trial. I cannot find parents, birthdays, marriages, real whole names, not a dang thing on these men. Colorado was not great at record keeping. I'm just saying. Okay. Not a lot is known about how the two men became ranch partners in Unaweep Canyon in 1883, so 2 years prior to Sam's little jaunt. They had apparently met while mining in the Silverton area. Sam had acquired land adjacent to West Creek on the north side of Unaweep Canyon near North Lobe Creek. He also had purchased horses and 46 head of cattle. John was meant to manage the ranch. So Sam had purchased the property and the animals, and John was there to be the ranch manager. Sam had developed the reputation of being eccentric and being prone to getting lost in the mountains. John, however, had cultivated a reputation as a tough guy. In the Grand Junction News in August of 1885, it was reported that he was one of those men who was anxious to be considered a bad man. John reportedly carried a pistol with a coffin and a grave etched into the handle and 3 notches on the butt of the gun. Although, whether he had earned those notches himself by killing men or claiming somebody else's murders was unknown. Sam saddled up a white horse named Old Bill. Now, his route to Silverton should have taken him down West Creek to the Dolores River at present-day Gateway, Colorado. Then he would have headed southeast to Telluride and over the mountains into Silverton. He had expected to be gone 3 or 4 weeks. So this is his plan. The same day, John reportedly headed to Pinyon Mesa to check on the summer range that he and Sam had used and to clean out a cabin they had there. So Sam is leaving on May 19th-ish. Okay. John returns from Pinyon Mesa on the 21st of May. Now, that's just a few days. That doesn't seem like a very long amount of time to go up into a canyon, check on some things, clean out a cabin, and come back. I don't know. Maybe he's a super fast housekeeper. Who knows? As John got back into Unaweep Canyon, he claimed he saw Old Bill, Sam's horse, wandering without a rider or saddle. Now, John said he wasn't particularly concerned. He figured the horse had gotten loose from wherever Sam had tied it, and Sam had continued on foot. John said that Sam was a man who would soon walk than ride. Seems like a lot of miles through mountains to be walking if taking a horse was going to take 3 or 4 weeks. But I don't know. Over the next few weeks, however, John told people he had heard nothing from Sam. He then sent a telegram from Whitewater to Silverton and learned that Sam had never arrived. So the people in town who knew Sam were not initially worried. He regularly, that's a hard word, regularly traveled to Silverton because he had mining interests there. As the weeks wore on with no word from Sam, concern developed and suspicion fell on his ranching partner, John. So in mid-July, a search was organized and John participated. He told people that he figured Sam had slipped into the waters of West Creek or the Dolores River and drowned. John also suggested there was not much point in continuing to search. However, the next week, another search was conducted, but this time John did not participate. Searchers looked above Unaweep Canyon near the trail to John's cabin. Okay, that cabin, he said, he went, yeah, that cabin. Buzzards circling near Campbell Point apparently directed them to the cliff. Now, Campbell Point got its name from this story we're talking about now, just so you're on the know, just so you're in the know there. So one of the searchers named John Noland said the first evidences suggested there was a body being dragged off a cliff some distance from a trail. And this was this was what he told the murder inquest in August of 1885. Nolan also said that John's summer cabin was 4 miles from the cliff. And he added that a button from a pair of pants was also found on this trail. Another searcher named Lewis Harms was lowered part the way down the cliff face to a small ledge where he found a section of gold watch chain and a vest. Eventually, that bit of chain was determined to match the watch chain worn by John Campbell. Later, 2 other men were lowered another 60 feet down the cliff and discovered Sam's badly decayed body, which they identified by his clothes and abundant whiskers. One of those 2 men was Bob, aka Ira Smith. You just think about that for a minute. Bob Smith stated that it appeared that the victim had been shot both through his chest and his ribs. He located a bullet-riddled vest and was also the one who kind of located where the body was dragged over the cliff. Bob was the first man to implicate Sam's partner, John Campbell. So Lewis, the searcher guy, Lewis Harms, he rode off to Grand Junction and notified Mesa County Deputy Sheriff, who returned with him to Unaweep Canyon and arrested John, and then took him to Grand Junction. There were threats of lynching, and John was portrayed as a conniving cowboy who had shot his partner in the back, carried his body off the top of a cliff, and then tossed it over. So recalling the case 50 years later, the deputy sheriff said that shortly after the coroner's inquest, and this is his quote, "The feeling of indignation among the cattlemen and citizens was so intense that there was strong talk of lynching him that night." So the deputy sheriff and the sheriff secretly moved John from the county jail to the city jail that night, and the next morning they took him by train to Gunnison. The evidence from the inquest was rehashed at John's trial in June of 1886, along with some new evidence. In John's cabin, 2 bloody blankets were found, which he reportedly used to transport Sam's body from where he was shot to the cliff. Also, information was presented at both the inquest and the trial that John had attempted to have a new partnership agreement between himself and Sam drawn up. However, it was witnessed after Sam had left and gone and was assumed disappeared. So his signature on that document was determined to be a forgery. On June 19, 1886, John Campbell was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 33 years in prison. That might have been the end of the case were it not for a train robbery a year later. Yeah, you see where this is all coming in here now? Yep. On the morning of November 3rd, 1887, Bob, also known as Ira, with his brother Jack Smith, along with Ed Rhodes and Bob W. Wallace, robbed a Denver and Rio Grande train near the Unaweep switch, a few miles east of Grand Junction, Colorado. Now, like I said before, this was the first DNRG train robbery after the rail was established 7 years prior to this, so back in 1880. These robbers had an ingenious getaway plan involving a boat, and that was frustrated entirely by bad luck, a relentless sheriff, and bad weather. And the whole thing only netted them about $150. So let's talk about the train robbery just a little bit here. The 4 outlaws ransacked the mail car looking for cash and valuables. Finding nothing of real value, they then proceeded to the express and baggage car. The baggage master, Dick Williams, recognized that the train was being robbed and resisted opening the door until the robbers threatened to dynamite it. Inside, there was a small safe with approximately $150 and a larger, more secure safe with more than $3,000. After his life was threatened, the baggage master reluctantly opened the smaller safe. However, he was unable to open the larger safe because he did not have the combination for it. C. For security against train robbers, because stagecoach robbery was now a huge thing, right? So in order to prevent robbery of trains, the D&RG Railroad did not give the combination to the large safe to anybody who was riding the train. The safe could only be accessed at certain stopping points along the route. Also, apparently, the train robbers did not have dynamite. So there's. After 35 minutes, the discouraged robbers conceded defeat, recognizing they could not open the larger safe, and disappeared into the night with a much smaller haul than they had anticipated. Later that morning, a Grand Junction posse arrived at the scene of the robbery. Spreading themselves out at the Unaweep switch, the posse unsuccessfully searched the entire area for tracks from the outlaws, and finding none, they disbanded after a couple of fruitless days. The morning of the robbery, the railroad had telegraphed Gunnison Sheriff Cyrus Doc Shores to assist in the capturing of the bandits. Doc Shores had a reputation of being a great lawman and a tracker, and as well as being a sheriff, he also doubled as a deputy United States Marshal, which allowed him to jump counties to investigate crimes in different jurisdictions. It meant he did not have he had the ability to investigate outside his own little sphere of authority. The D&RG Railroad desperately wanted to make an example of the robbers and turned to Doc Shores because of his renowned tracking abilities. When he arrived at the scene, Sheriff Shores was initially perplexed. He and his brother-in-law, M.L. Allison of Grand Junction, Colorado, spent 2 days circling the area along the railroad tracks that followed alongside the Gunnison River to Delta. The switch was at a point where the Gunnison River is generally too deep to ford with horses, yet without any tracks, Doc Shore began to suspect that the outlaws must have come from the other side of the river. Allison surmised then that the train robbers must have wings. The next day, Shores and Allison ferried their horses across the Colorado River at Grand Junction, and after another thorough search late in the day, they discovered 2 separate sets of footprints along the riverbank on the opposite side of the Gunnison River, upstream from where the train robbery had occurred. To confuse the trackers, the robbers had separated into 2 parties as they emerged from the crossing of the river. Each pair in the group followed the lead person's footsteps onto dry land for a distance, hoping to dissuade anyone tracking them down from believing that there were 4 train robbers. They weren't dumb, y'all. They kind of had some plans going on here. However, Doc Shores did not fall for their trickery. He found it unusual that they were on foot and didn't have horses or other means of transportation on the other side of the river, though. Returning the following day, Doc Shores and Allison found 4 sets of footprints converging and entering into Bangs Canyon. The lawmen tracked them down over difficult rocky terrain for 20 miles into Bangs Canyon until Sheriff Shores was convinced that the outlaws were headed to the Dolores River area The Dolores River area would be a good place to hide in, and Doc Shores determined that they needed to get there first. So Doc Shores and his men spent the next few weeks following what they believed was the most likely path the robbers would take to get to this place where he assumed or he predicted they wanted to hide. He had 4 men with him, or him and 3 other men, and these men were caught up in terrible weather. They had no shelter. The conditions were so bad that one of the posse members fell very ill with pneumonia and needed to be returned to town for treatment. So Doc Shores took this man back to a train for Denver so he could head back to town and get treatment, and he actually died from contracting pneumonia. So after Doc put this man on a train, he met up with the remaining members of the posse, and they continued toward Grand Junction, stopping at Delta, where they learned from the residents the identities of the robbers and that a boat was involved. Up to this point, Doc Shores questioned why the outlaws were on foot. Now he knew. So the Smith brothers, Bob, aka Ira, and Jack, along with Rhodes and Wallace, met shortly before the train robbery while working on the Midland Ranch in Carbondale, Colorado. The Smith brothers would have been particularly familiar with the area, having spent a large amount of time in recent years working for the state, primarily in Mesa County. They worked in the Mesa County along the western border and the eastern Utah border. So right there where Colorado and Utah meet. And they worked on ranches herding cattle. So the Smith brothers probably developed the plan to rob the D and RG Railroad and escape by boat down the Gunnison and Grand River. And they theorized that this plan was possibly thought up of at least a year earlier based on reports from people in the town. So the 4 men quit their current jobs and they traveled to Delta and built a boat. Now, describing the strangers, people in Delta said that the 4 men came to their town shortly before the train robbery. They were there on foot, leading a black pack horse with supplies. They set up a camp along the Gunnison River outside of town and proceeded to build a boat. Okay, my thoughts are, you've come up with this ingenious plan to rob a train where there's a close river crossing and take a boat and get out of Dodge. And you're going to build said boat in public view of everybody in a small town? This is where they got stupid. I mean, this is not mastermind criminal behavior here. Anyways, the project attracted attention, and had townspeople stopping to observe the boat's progress. For several days, while the boat was being built, the strangers, these train robbers or would-be robbers, shared some information about themselves in casual conversation with the onlookers, and other information like their names were overheard by the strangers or overheard by the townspeople when these strangers, these 4 bank robbers, talked to each other. A day or 2 before the robbery, Jack Smith sold the pack horse to a resident, and the 4 men loaded the boat with guns and supplies and launched it into the river and headed toward Unaweep Switch, where the robbery was planned. Doc Shores and his posse tracked them over 3 months' time and arrested them in Utah. Brothers Bob and Jim Smith were sent to prison along with Ed Rhodes and Bob Boyd. Now, Bob Boyd had a couple of different aliases that he was working with, and he already had a pretty extensive criminal past. Now, have you figured out the link yet? James and Bob, aka Ira Smith, had testified at John Campbell's trial. It was Bob who first spotted Sam's body on the ledge. In 1891, a Denver newspaper reporter reported that while the two Smiths were in jail in Denver after the train robbery, they told another inmate they had killed Samuel Jones at the behest of the Telluride mining interests. They reportedly drew a map showing where Sam's saddle was stashed and where they had hid $2,500 they had taken off of him. Not everyone accepted that story. An article in the Grand Valley Star said multiple witnesses could place the Smith brothers in Grand Junction at the same time of Sam's murder. The Star added that most of the local citizens believed that John Campbell was suffering the penalty for the awful crime that he had committed. Not everybody was so sure that John Campbell was in jail for the right reasons. By 1895, both the judge who conducted John's trial and the district attorney who had prosecuted him recommended to the governor of Colorado, Albert McIntyre, that Campbell be pardoned. McIntyre agreed, and on July 4th, 1896, Campbell was released from the state penitentiary in Canyon City. After that, he disappeared from newspaper records. The money supposedly stashed by the Smith brothers was never found. Thanks for hanging on till the very end, guys. I know this was a longer than average video, but the story was fascinating when I was doing my research, and I found that these two Smith brothers were involved in two completely separate crimes in the same few years. I knew it had to be one story. It needed to be one video, especially since I needed to do something big since I completely jumped over the state of Colorado. So to the state of Colorado and the people who live there, I apologize, and I hope this made up for my temporary lapse of ability to read an alphabetized list. And I apologize for the fact that this was a really words is hard kind of day. Thanks for hanging on. I have added a couple of other videos here for you to watch, as well as a subscribe button. If you have not already subscribed to my channel, I would love it if you did so. Give me a thumbs up, leave me a comment, and I hope you have a really great day.